Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. We talk a lot about the big monumental battles of the Civil War and detail all the action of those battles. Yet we don't talk quite so much about the sieges that happened during the Civil War and all the small actions, those daily bits of existence, the daily struggles for survival on those siege lines, men getting picked off on the picket lines every day. Well, I have an interesting story to share with you. It's remarkably detailed, at least in my research experience, and it involves the officer pictured here. His name is Captain George Hall of the 123rd New York Infantry. He and his regiment happens to be in the front lines, the siege lines of Atlanta in the summer of 1864. So I want to take you back there now and talk about what happened. He was in command of the picket line of his brigade. And there's some interesting information here about the anxiety and stress that he felt and others felt and what happened. So let's go to the story. Confederate sharpshooters were picking off Union soldiers with terrible accuracy on those siege lines around Atlanta during that summer of 1864. Was a nest of marksmen particularly effective along one section where the blue and gray pickets were so close together that ordinary conversation was possible across the stretch of ground, the barren stretch of ground between those two lines. That is, if anyone cared to talk. Most of the Federals, so it turns out, preferred not to waste their energy on idle chatter. The searing rays of the sun sapped their strength as they sweltered in the rifle pits, protected by little more than their wits and dirty scraps of canvas from their dog tents. The soldiers along this part of the line were commanded by Captain Hall. He was a mason by trade from upstate New York, 24 years old when he started the war as a lieutenant. He saw his share of fighting at Chancellorsville, at Gettysburg, and earlier during the Atlanta campaign at Kennesaw Mountain. At Gettysburg, his captain suffered a mortal wound, and Hall was promoted to fill his vacancy. Now, in Atlanta, Hall had charge of the picket line of his brigade. On July 29th, 1864, he received orders from the brass to silence the sharpshooters that were pestering and picking off the men. The orders also had another purpose. In the wake of the recent battles around Atlanta, Union commanders wanted to know the condition and position of rebel troops. So the attack was scheduled for the next morning, July 30th. Hall prepped the soldiers, many of whom belonged to his own regiment, and there were others from Pennsylvania and Connecticut. The plan called for them to capture the posts along the enemy picket line and then to occupy a wooded ridge beyond it. There's a quote from a sergeant who was part of the action, a sergeant named Rice Bull, who served with Hall in the 123rd. Sergeant Bull said, quote, "The advance was to be made at daybreak, but we were not to fire during the night unless we were attacked. There were to be no cheers or fire until we reached their posts so as to surprise them if we could," end quote. Hall had his work cut out for him. He was going into action with only one officer to assist him, a lieutenant from the 46th Pennsylvania Infantry. There were two other officers assigned to him, a captain and a lieutenant from the 5th Connecticut Infantry, but they declined to participate. Hall explained after the war, quote, "Their time was out the next day and they would not come up to the picket line to help." And the captain ranked me. So Hall and one other officer's job was up to them to lead the attack. Anxiety ran high as the men waited for dawn. Sergeant Rice recalled, quote, "We could get no sleep, and it seemed one of the longest nights of my life." He continued, "It was nerve-wracking, but the longest night will have an end." And just about 4:30 a.m., we saw the darkness going and wanted the action to begin and end as soon as possible, end quote. The sergeant continued, quote, "Just as it was light enough, we stepped out of our rifle pits and headed to the front. It did not take long to cover the greater part of the distance. Strange to say, not a shot greeted us. When nearly on them, the Confederates, we took to double quick, and just before we reached their line, a few shots were fired, but they were so wild, no one was hit. We had given them a complete surprise and were over their trench. Many of the Johnnies were in their pits asleep and did not know there was any trouble until they were prisoners. A few tried to put up a fight, but were soon dispersed of. 3 or 4 were wounded, but most surrendered at once without making any resistance. We captured their entire picket line of nearly 200 men with scarcely any loss to ourselves." End quote. The prisoners were Georgia State militiamen who were not particularly well trained, and they were sent to the rear as Hall and his pickets advanced and occupied the heavily wooded ridge. Union sharpshooters were brought in, and they turned the tables on their gray foemen. Scattered musket fire broke out as the men quickly dug makeshift rifle pits using their bayonets and anything they could find in their haversacks, including dishes. The sergeant put his 2 cents in, quote, "It was really wonderful how fast one could pile up material sufficient to stop bullets when they were singing about him." Before long, the Confederates opened up on Hall's position with artillery. Heavy guns sent many shots tearing through the trees, making fearful noises and breaking down large branches. And when they fell, they were more dangerous than shot and shell, declared Sergeant Rice. Hall reported, quote, "I never had as hard a day's work to keep my men from leaving the position," end quote. Then a line of enemy pickets approached. The sergeant recalled, quote, "Their artillery and skirmishing was lively all the afternoon," end quote. The fighting continued all day until 6 o'clock p.m., when Hall and his men were finally relieved. In retrospect, the sergeant observed, the action, quote, "was a fair example of the many that were fought during the investment of the city. They were nameless and unheralded battles and were fought only by a few men on either side, but they were just as deadly and full of peril as a pitched battle." Union casualties amounted to 3 killed and 9 wounded. There was never any full statement that I could find of the total number involved. Confederate losses, in addition to the 200 militiamen captured, were not reported. Hall received praise from a senior officer for his leadership. Quote, "No more faithful, brave, and efficient officer of his rank served in that campaign," end quote. The pressure did hit Hall, however. He fell ill the next day, exhausted from lack of sleep and burdened by the weight of his responsibilities. He spent the next 3 months on and off the sick list, but he refused to enter the hospital, although the regimental surgeon practically begged him. He refused to do it. He preferred to remain with his men in the trenches. Hall remained on duty, sick most of the time with his comrades, eventually recovered and did so in time to participate in the March to the Sea and the campaign through the Carolinas. Hall survived it all, mustered out of the Army with the survivors of the regiment in June 1865. Before the end of the year, perhaps inspired by wanderlust from his wartime service, he settled in Iowa, moving to the township of Sharon, which is located outside of Iowa City. He married in 1868 and fathered two boys and two girls. He's a member of the Presbyterian Church and a staunch Republican, the party of Lincoln. He served in various roles in local government, including township clerk, tax assessor, and a census enumerator. He lived a long life. Kidney disease broke his health in 1914, and he died a year later at age 74. So there you have it, the story of George Hall of the 123rd New York Infantry and his nerve-wracking, high anxiety-filled experience in the siege lines in Atlanta, near Atlanta, in July of 1864. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.